Hello class, this is Dr. Branch. I trust you're having a good day. This lecture is going to review Chapter 3 from the book Common Sense Economics. So we're going to talk about several of the principles they discuss for how government relates to progress, economic progress. First is this: government promotes economic progress by protecting the rights of individuals and supplying a few goods that are difficult to provide through markets. That's their first principle. And the authors are basically arguing for a limited role for government as opposed to a more expansive and intrusive role for government. Some of the things that they might suggest are appropriate for government is enforcing rules against theft, fraud, and violence. And we saw that in the last lecture from Common Sense Economics. This is central. The government has to do this for economic progress to occur, and countries where this doesn't happen are locked in cycles of poverty. Productive, providing public goods no one person or company could supply on its own, no one person. A national defense, flood control, we'll see this in just a moment, mosquito abatement. So none of us on our own could provide for the national defense. The government needs to do that. Now here's, this is a problem. This is my statement here. Some have a euphoric optimism that government can solve all of our problems, and this can become idolatrous, where instead of having faith in God or the abilities God has given us to steward, we become trusting in government, and it can make an idol out of government. Let me use the Tennessee Valley Authority as a good example of government involvement. This is a flood in the Tennessee Valley back in the 1920s. This occurred all the time. The river was kind of winding and out of control, and it was difficult for communities to know what was going to happen the next spring when flood season came. This also led to a great deal of erosion because of some poor farming practices. This was a problem across the southern United States. You can still walk through woods in the South today and you'll come across a deep ravine in the middle of the woods. What that usually tells you is that at some point in the past that was a cotton field of some sort, and it had eroded away. Well, the question was, how do we preserve this resource of the valley? It's very fertile. The water is actually obviously a natural resource. How do you preserve it and manage it? So the Roosevelt administration began what we now know as the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the idea was, among many things, to control the flooding of the Tennessee Valley and to also provide electricity for that rural region. This is a political cartoon from the Jersey City General, and here you have FDR here in a kitchen, and he's playing around with this TVA washing machine, and this whole question is the TVA going to survive all these Supreme Court? Because if you remember, the Supreme Court struck down most of these alphabet organizations he had come up with to try to bring the country out of depression. Well, the TVA actually survived, and this is the political cartoon from our own Kansas City Star in 1936, which shows that he actually he struck lightning, right? So lightning has struck in a good way, not a bad way, but in a good way. So the TVA survived a Supreme Court test. It's a government-owned corporation. And this just gives you an idea of the massive amount of engineering involved in the entire TVA authority, all these different dams and their elevation that help control the river throughout Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama. That's Fontana Dam. So my point is that the Tennessee Valley Authority needed to control that entire region. No one individual or corporation could do that, and it was appropriate for the government and the Corps of Engineers to step in and manage that river, and it has been effective for the most part. So allocation through political voting is fundamentally different from market allocation. And what they're basically arguing here is that policies favored by the majority may not always be the best idea. So when the majority votes in a new tax increase, they may be coercing others to participate in the project. So they're just basically saying the majority is not always right, and they would favor market-driven decisions. The cost of government are not only taxes. Now this is important. The government, more than anything else, seems to want your money. So they're basically stressing there is an opportunity cost to government projects. We're back to this central idea of opportunity cost. If you choose to do one thing, it means you can't do something else. If my money is taken from me, from the federal government, to spend on something else, that means I can't spend that money to buy someone's product and help boost the economy. So There is the loss of private sector output that could have been produced with the resources now employed producing the goods and services supplied by the government. So if the government steps into private industry and the government starts producing certain resources, some widget, then that means that other people can't produce that widget, if you will, and so that's private sector income that's no longer being generated. There is also the cost of resources expended in the collection of taxes and the enforcement of compliance with government mandates. For example, my wife works in healthcare. She's a supervisor and nurse case managers at a local hospital. A great deal of their time is spent chasing down Obamacare policies. And then there's the cost of price distortions resulting from taxes and borrowing. But I would also add here, there's the cost, the opportunity cost. If the government takes my money via taxes, that means I can't spend that money on someone's product in the economy. Unless restrained by constitutional rules, special interest groups will use the democratic process to fleece taxpayers and consumers. So they have a two terms here you need to know for the final. The first is log rolling. These are two political terms, log rolling and pork barrel. I want you to know both of them. Log rolling is a practice common in the U.S. Congress, and what it does is two or more legislators agree for each to trade his or her vote on one bill he cares little about in exchange for the other's vote on a bill that is personally much more important to him or to her. So if you have a representative from Nebraska and they want some huge farm relief bill, and then there's a representative from New York, well, that the lady from New York may not care about farm relief very much, but she's very concerned in urban renewal. Well, the gentleman from Nebraska may not be concerned about urban renewal, but he's very concerned about farm relief. So they agree to vote for each other's projects, even though they don't really care about either one of them, just to get more votes for their own project. Pork barrel is probably a bigger problem, in my opinion. Appropriations of public funds by Congress for projects that do not serve the interest of any large portion of the country's citizenry, but are nevertheless vigorously promoted by a small group of legislators. This because it will pump outside taxpayer money and resources into local districts that the legislators represent. You see an idea of this if you've ever seen the old movie with Jimmy Stewart called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. That's basically what you're looking at. It's a huge pork barrel thing that's being attached to this relief bill, and it's actually funneling millions of dollars, and he of course filibusters against it. And what happens is frequently pork barrel gets attached to larger bills. So there'll be some bill, let's use farm relief for example, some huge bill about farm relief, and at the last minute some group comes in and says, well, we want to attach a rider to this bill about additional Medicare benefits for veterans. Well, what do farm relief and veterans have to do with each other? Not a lot, but you get the idea. It's pork, it's fat that's added to a bill. That's why it's called pork barrel. Those two terms, log rolling, where you swap votes, and then pork barrel, where you add fat to a bill, those two terms will be on the final. I'm going to say a quick word about budget deficits. Unless restrained by constitutional rules, legislators will run budget deficits and spend excessively. So what I would say here is your textbook is basically begging for a constitutional amendment to give us a balanced budget. Here's a deficit. When a government spending exceeds its revenues, that's simple enough. Most people should know this. But legislators do indeed, and I think your textbook is right here, have a strong incentive to spend money on programs that benefit the voters in their district. Again, that's pork barrel stuff. And special interest groups that will help them win re-election. So what they're arguing is legislators get very self-serving because they want to get re-elected. They want to spend money, and essentially in spending this money in many cases, it's not for the common good. They're just basically buying votes of people that are going to vote for them. Well, what happens is with all this is the budget's just out of control. The deficit's getting larger and larger and larger. This is actually out of date. This is we're at $19 trillion in federal deficit now. It is just enormous. The Medicare is actually the fastest growing major entitlement in the budget. I say fastest growing as opposed to largest. Social Security is the largest, but Medicare is the fastest growing, and it's going to grow even faster now that we have Obamacare and millions of more people being added to it. In 1993, Social Security passed national defense as the largest federal spending category and remains first today. This is what I'm about to say is my opinion. The national debt is the greatest threat to national security. And when we had World War II, our government borrowed a lot of money to fund World War II. That's how we paid for the war. We borrowed money. My fear is if another evil person like Hitler comes along, we're not going to have the money to fund the war. We're going to be so deep in debt that we can't borrow the money we need to fight that war. So in that sense, I think that the national debt is actually the greatest threat to national security. In the long run, I actually believe the national debt is a greater threat than Islamic terrorism. Islamic terrorism is a threat. They're evil and they need to be stopped. But if you're asking at the big picture level, I think the national debt is a bigger threat. That's my opinion. So, government slows economic progress when it becomes heavily involved in providing favors at the expense of others. But their basic point is this: you can get wealth in two different ways. You can produce something or you can plunder somebody else who has produced something. And so they're arguing that some special interest groups use the government as a tool to plunder people who've been very successful in life. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time here, and then I'm going to close, and you can read the other 3 points on your own. The net gain to those receiving government transfers is less and often substantially less than the amount they receive. LBJ's War on Poverty is it's a very good example of this truth right here, but it's a sad example. So on January 8th, 1964, LBJ says this administration here and now declares unconditional war on poverty in America. Well, here's what you found since the war on poverty. The poverty level was steadily declining before LBJ declared his war on poverty, and since then it's been stuck at about 12%. Basically, a case can be made that LBJ's war on poverty didn't help. It actually stopped a trend of declining poverty in the United States. Well, why is that? An increase in government transfers will reduce the incentive of both the taxpayer donor and the transfer recipient to earn an income. Your second textbook, When Helping Hurts, spends more time talking about this dynamic, but basically the welfare system imposed by LBJ has de-incentivized people to get off welfare. They make just enough money to stay on it, and if you start doing things that benefit you, you're penalized by the government. It's insane. Competition for transfers will erode most of the long-term gain of the intended beneficiaries, and programs that protect potential recipients against adversity arising from their imprudent decisions encourage them to make choices that increase the likelihood of adversity. What that means is, by people never feeling the pain of their decision, it just allows them to keep making that decision. When I was a young man, I got caught paying I got a huge speeding ticket, and it was an enormous fine. And my father made me feel the pain of that, and that I had to work a week in a sawmill during school. It was just insane. During the January of 1985. It was bitterly cold, and I worked all that week, and I took my entire paycheck to pay this speeding ticket. Well, the point is, I felt the pain of that traffic violation, and it highly motivated me to be more thoughtful in the future. What the authors are saying is we have government programs where it protects people from ever feeling the pain, and when they don't feel the pain, they never learn, and they just keep making the same mistakes over and over again. So, 3 things that you can do to avoid poverty. This is what I would say. First of all, several studies have shown this. This is fascinating data. If people do these 3 things, they have a good chance of avoiding poverty. First, completing high school. Secondly, working full-time. And then third, getting married before having a child. Research has shown that if people do these 3 things, their chances of avoiding poverty go up extremely high. Just those 3 simple things, even in the competitive environment we have today. In 1963, 6% of American children were born out of wedlock. Today, that number stands at 41% and even higher. This chart should cause you to shudder for our country. It shows the number of children born out of wedlock. And part of the problem with this, it's not the entire problem, but part of this data is reflective of government policies that protect people from feeling the pain of having children out of wedlock. That's not all of this data, but that is a definite component of it. And so here you see the total families with children Married couples with children in their thousands has kind of leveled off and declined some. Single parents with children has grown extremely high. It's gone up and gone up exponentially. This does not bode well for helping someone get out of poverty, break cycles of poverty. So I want you to read the other 3 points in your textbook on your own, but this gives you an idea of some of the important ideas from Chapter 3 in Common Sense Economics.